Good afternoon and Waminjika. Wherever you are today and wherever you work, live and play, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country each of us is meeting on. For me here in Naarm, that is the Bunurong, Wiradjuri and Wadawurrung people. We recognise your continuing connection to the land and waters and acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land and commit to building a brighter future together. My name is Sharon Braun and I'm an Associate Director with CEDA. I am pleased to welcome you to today's live stream discussion on the findings and recommendations from the Productivity Commission's draft report on the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. Released last week, the report highlights areas of improvement and emphasises where additional effort is required to close the gap. With Productivity Commission Chairman Michael Brennan and Commissioners Romlie Mokak and Natalie Siegel-Brown, we will hear about how the Commission became to be involved in the review, the support and advice from First Nations peoples, what is required from governments to meet the agreement targets, and what is the next step in the review process. CEDA supports the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament, and we will also explore today how a positive result in the upcoming referendum might impact closing the gap policy and decision making. As always, the opportunity to actively participate in today's conversation is a mainstay of CEDA's forums. Follow CEDA across our social media channels and add your comments and key takeaways using the hashtag Closing the Gap. Put your questions to the panel via our Pigeonhole app, which is available just below the live stream window on your screen, or log in on your devices by entering the URL ceda.pigeonhole.at and enter using the password Closing the Gap. We will endeavour to ask as many of your questions as time allows, but to help us understand those questions with the broadest interest, please review and vote on the questions entered by your fellow participants. Please also take a moment at the end of the live stream to rate your experience of today's discussion. Before we kick things off, I would like to thank Australian Unity for their support of today's live stream. Australian Unity is Australia's first member-owned wellbeing company with a long history of providing home care services for Aboriginal people by Aboriginal people. AU employs nearly 300 First Nations peoples in its Aboriginal home health team and is committed to building strong, respectful and resilient relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities and businesses. Australian Unity is also an important member of our community and has been a CEDA member since 1991. Now it is my pleasure to introduce your facilitator for today's discussion. We are delighted to welcome Trish Oxford back to the CEDA stage. She is a proud Ngemba woman from Bourke in New South Wales and is General Manager of Indigenous Business and Community Engagement at Australian Unity. Trish has more than 25 years' experience working in senior executive roles across human, health and financial services and is also a board member at Social Futures. Trish, thanks so much for supporting today's live stream and for driving the ship. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Sharon, for your very warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'd like to welcome you all to CEDA's Closing the Gap Productivity Commission Review discussion, where our panel will unpack the findings and recommendations of the National Agreement on the Closing the Gap Review, and importantly, discuss how the commitments made by governments under the agreement are tracking. As I mentioned, it's a privilege to be here with you today, having this incredibly important conversation, particularly during this uncertain time for our mob. But before we start, I too would like to acknowledge the Bundjalung people, the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which I live and live stream from today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us this afternoon. So as Sharon mentioned, my name is Trish Oxford and I'm a proud Niimba woman from Bourke in far northwest New South Wales and Australian Unity's General Manager for Indigenous Business and Community Engagement. So before we cross to our panel, I too wanted to let you know that we'll be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A session. And Pigeonhole Live is a simple, interactive mobile website where you can submit questions to the panel of speakers, and you can also vote on any questions that interest you. If you have a smartphone, tablet, or laptop, just launch your internet browser and enter ceda.pigeonhole.at into the address bar, and next key in our event passcode, which again is closing the gap, all one word. And I really encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. So please submit them through Pigeonhole and we'll get to them towards the end of the live stream. Questions with the highest number of votes will have a better chance to be answered by the speakers. So now I too would like to extend a very warm welcome to our panel members. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Productivity Commission Chairman Michael Brennan and Commissioners Natalie Siegel-Brown and Duty Man Romlie Mokak. Very warm welcome to you all. And so to kick off, Michael, let's go to you first. Michael, can you explain the purpose of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap? And how does this initiative differ from previous Closing the Gap strategies?
Well, thank you, Trish, and it's great to be here. The Closing the Agreement Gap, the Closing the Gap Agreement, rather, was an agreement struck in 2020. And it's not the first of its kind. There were predecessor agreements, but there were a couple of aspects that set this agreement apart. The first is that it's an agreement not only between the Commonwealth Government and all of the state and territory governments, and it does also include the Australian Local Government Association, so it covers all three tiers of government in Australia. But it's also an agreement that is struck with representatives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. It was struck with a coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, the Coalition of Peaks. They are a party to the agreement, along with First Ministers. They are all signatories. And as our report makes clear, the fact that this was an agreement that had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia at the table represented changes the nature of the expectations, the accountabilities that, feed into the review that we've just done. The agreement itself does a couple of things. It sets out 17 socioeconomic outcome areas, effectively targets which are to be tracked and reported on. But the other thing which set this agreement apart was it said something about the how. In other words, how was it that governments were committing to try and meet the targets embedded in these 17 socioeconomic outcomes? And in particular, governments agreed to 4 priority reforms. In summary, they were, firstly, a priority reform around shared decision-making, so establishing partnership arrangements with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives in order to drive shared decision-making across the length and breadth of service delivery. A second priority reform, which was about strengthening the Aboriginal community-controlled sector. A third priority reform, which was about transforming government entities. So government looking within itself and what were the transformational things that government had to do in order to better deliver for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on the ground. And the fourth was to do with data, better sharing data with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. So the fact that those 4 priority reforms were so central to this agreement was a change. And that has really been the central focus of this draft report.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'm going to stay with you for the next question. And so we're wondering if you can further explain how and why the Productivity Commission is involved in this review.
Sure. Well, as it happens, the Productivity Commission is actually enshrined or has a role that's enshrined in the agreement itself. So we receive the terms of reference from government, but ultimately the authority for the Productivity Commission to be operating in this space is embedded in the agreement. And essentially we have 2 roles under the agreement. One is that we do a reporting role. So we effectively track progress against the targets that are laid down in the agreement, those 17 socioeconomic outcome areas. We look at the numbers, we explain whether or not we think a particular target is on track to be met or not, and provide various disaggregations, how it's going by state and other complementary data. But the second thing we do is we are asked to do a 3-yearly review of progress under the agreement. And this is the first of those 3 yearly reviews. As I said, this agreement is only 3 years old. It was signed in 2020. So it's early days. And as a result, we thought for the first of these 3 yearly review processes, we should focus not so much just on the socioeconomic outcome areas, because it is early to track progress on those, but perhaps to focus a little bit more on those 4 priority reforms that I outlined. How is it that governments are going about delivering on those priority reforms? Now, governments have laid out various implementation plans. They've listed all manner of activities that they're undertaking with a view to trying to close the gap. And we are essentially tasked with making an assessment of those implementation plans. What is it the government's committing to? We talk to government. We certainly talked a lot to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations and people on the ground. So the conclusions that you see released last week, and which Romlie and Natalie will talk us through, are really embedded in that draft report. They're in that spirit. We've put them out there. They reflect our judgment based on what we've heard and what we have assessed on the back of what government has put to us. But it's a draft report. We're hoping that it prompts a bit of discussion, certainly hoping that it prompts a few submissions back to us as we work through to a final report, which will go to the Joint Council, so that group of First Ministers and representatives of the Coalition of Peaks, in December of this year.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for really highlighting the purpose of the National Agreement and the key focus areas, and really importantly, the role of First Nations representatives. So thank you very much. So now we're going to turn to Romlie Mokak. So Rom, one of the priority reform areas is to ensure that governments are accountable for closing the gap outcomes and are culturally safe and responsive to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, Rom, how will the findings in this report help to transform the way governments work to meet this really important priority?
Thanks, Trish. So I think what you're speaking to there is one of the priority reforms committed to under the agreement. Michael mentioned the 4 priority reforms. The third one is about transforming government itself. Now, what I'd say is that, and often remind people that the agreement isn't just words on the page, right? These are commitments, firm commitments made by governments in partnership with the Coalition of Peaks as representatives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities. So these are commitments made by governments themselves. And that priority reform 3, transforming mainstream organisations, governmental organisations, is so critical to the success or otherwise of the whole of the agreement. We can't overemphasise that point. Now, what we're seeing is, in the main, that governments haven't really grasped the scale, the size of that transformation agenda. Our overall assessment is that governments haven't quite got the depth of what is required in order for there to be structural and systemic reform. So having said that, there are a number of examples that are positive examples of the change, but these are in pockets. These are small in number, piecemeal, and not at the kind of systems level that would be required. And we've got a number of findings and I guess invitations for feedback around how to bolster, how to strengthen those accountability frameworks across a number of things. And we can probably get into that conversation in Q&A, Trish. On that point about cultural safety, culture is central to this agreement. The agreement recognises that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's culture is central to the agenda going forward. What isn't well described or defined within the agreement is what that means. What it does speak to under this priority reform 3 is the importance of cultural safety, and I'd also highlight the other commitment made, and there are a number of them under this priority reform, but the other really strong commitment made in the agreement, and we've been hearing resoundingly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves, is that the commitment of governments to identify and eliminate racism is fundamental to the pursuit of the outcomes of the agreement going forward. So I'll just make those 2 points. In terms of how this report of the Productivity Commission might influence change, this is the draft report. As Michael said, we're seeking responses and feedback. We want people to give us their strong view about where we've landed on a few things, our findings, etc., the kind of questions that we're putting forward, in order for there to be a much stronger and clearer final report that we'll deliver to government through the Joint Government and Coalition of Peaks, I should say, through the Joint Council on Closing the Gap in December.
Great, thank you, Rom. And just, we're interested to know if there is support from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for the Closing the Gap agreement and review process. And how are you ensuring that our people are being heard and their feedback is incorporated into the process?
Absolutely, there's support to the national agreement. We've heard this far and wide, and I guess the fears that a lot of our people have is that this will just be yet another agreement, often articulated as a broken promise to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We can't, for many of our mob, and I'll say our mob because as you introduced me, I'm a Juukan man from the West Kimberley, but for many of our mob, we've been on this business for a long time. So 2008, there was the first agreement on Closing the Gap, National Indigenous Reform Agreement. 2020, this next iteration. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been advocating for a long time for these improvements. The promise in this agreement, as Michael's articulated, is those 4 priority reforms where we've focused our attention on under this current review. And that's about the how. Often we kind of get locked into a conversation about the what. Trying to get improvements on particular targets, etc. This agreement speaks directly to the how, and this is what a lot of our people are saying. The how is so important, and they want to be a part of the process of shared decision making. What that means is that power necessarily needs to be relinquished by governments in order for that to be fully realised. On the point about how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's inputs into this review are being handled and considered, we made it very clear from the start that we needed to go out to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to seek their views on our engagement approach. So if people online today are interested in some of the earlier resources and publications that we've put out in advance of this draft report, the first paper was on our engagement approach. We had a number of principles in that engagement approach. The importance of relationality, for example, reciprocity. These are ways that we operate as Indigenous peoples. Indeed, the Indigenous peoples of the world operate in this way. You're connected to each other and you have obligations to each other. So what does that look like from a Productivity Commission perspective? So we articulated that through the engagement approach paper, got overwhelming responses from not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but governments, non-government organisations as well. Now, having said that, we can't just operate on the basis of principle alone. And so the way in which we've conducted this review is to centre, as best we could, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not only our people, but priorities, perspectives and knowledges of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And a simple metric, for example, to indicate that commitment is of the 180 odd meetings, 2/3 of those meetings, 120, were with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations. So it's not just not enough to go out and seek engagement. It has to be very intentional. And furthermore, what we've also done is just employed a fairly simple instrument, really. So when we go out and meet with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations, we can't be presumptive in what we hear as being the priorities for which they want to convey their messages. So there's a cyclical process of going back to organisations and individuals that we meet with to confirm that that's precisely what they have said to us, and how we should understand what it is that they're saying to us, rather than just leaving it up to the Commission's interpretation alone. Now, there may be some who would say, I can't see my submission or my voice in the draft report. Now, obviously, that's not possible to reflect right across the board. But what I can say is that the report would not be the report that it is without Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's commitment and engagement to the review, and the willingness, the generosity in which they engaged with us and shared with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Rom, for really outlining the engagement practices of the Commission and ensuring that the mob's voice is heard throughout the process. So thank you again. And it's really clear that governments have much more to do to maintain their commitments under the Closing the Gap agreement. So now over to you, Nat. So Nat, there's a lot of public discussion about how the referendum on the Voice to Parliament will impact Closing the Gap policy and decision making. So has the referendum impacted in any way the Productivity Commission's review considerations?
Well, the first thing I need to say is that our job was solely to review the progress made by governments against the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. That was the limit of our scope, and we didn't have any role at looking at anything specifically to do with the referendum. However, we can't ignore the prospect that the agreement may operate in a future where there is an Indigenous voice to Parliament. So when we look forward, we of course have thought about how the agreement might coexist with a voice. So if the voice comes about through the referendum, we've suggested that it could augment or support holding governments to accountable under the agreement. Equally, if there's not a voice, there are a range of other measures that we believe should be adopted to hold governments accountable under the agreement. But I should say, if you look at the agreement, there is a very clear mandate for governments to not just listen, but act upon the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities through that very first priority reform that Michael talked about earlier, and that is shared decision-making, sharing power and proper, thorough engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So not consulting at the end of a process on a matter that is effectively already predetermined by governments. So if you consider what that first priority is really all about, it is about giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people self-determination and leadership over issues that impact their communities. That's not necessarily the same as a voice to Parliament, and that's obviously a matter for the Australian people to decide and for governments to work through. But we are clear that a voice to Parliament should not replace the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. And it certainly should not replace it when you consider the very serious, major obligations that governments have signed up to, particularly under those priority reforms. So a voice in and of itself shouldn't mean that governments can resile from any of their commitments under those priority reforms or their commitments under the targets.
Great, thank you, Nat. Shared decision-making across the board is so important. So beyond this report, what's next for the review process, and what will the commissioners be focusing on in the lead up to the final report?
So we are really keen to hear what everybody thinks about our draft assessment of progress, and that includes everybody who's listening today. The draft report actually points to several information requests where we'd specifically like to hear more information, where we think we need to hear from MOB in particular about where progress is currently unclear, things that might better help inform our assessment. But we're also looking for some specific examples of what's working and what's not. To that end, we made a commitment when we first set out to engage. And we actually put out a paper. Our very first paper is all about how we plan to go about this review and to take feedback on that. And we committed to doing particular case studies. We definitely plan to still do that. So we will dive into some of those specific targets or those socioeconomic outcomes. And a perfect example might be in out-of-home carer, an area where you and I both once worked many moons ago, Trish, in relation to looking at when you take a specific target and you think about those 4 priority reforms as the real key levers for change, how are they actually operating in practice? In this third stage of engagement, we're also really looking to talk to people who rarely get a voice in policy discussions, but who might be most impacted by the outcomes of the agreement. So they might be children and young people with a care experience, people who've had an incarceration experience, people who've experienced homelessness. So we will continue to engage with MOB through ACOs and so on, but we will also be looking to engage with community members more broadly, not just users of services, but also people who may experience barriers to accessing services. We would love to hear from anybody listening today in whatever way you're comfortable. We know that written submissions aren't always the easiest. You're all very, very busy people. So we can take oral submissions, we can take emails, we can set up a meeting, any way you wish to engage. If you did want to send a submission, of course, that would be really, really valuable for us to have things in writing. But as I mentioned, we can engage in whatever way works for you. So our engagement is going to really continue between August and November, and then we'll formulate our final report. And we'll put that final report to the Joint Council on Closing the Gap in December 2023 and publish it shortly after that.
Great. Thank you, Nat. And it's so pleasing to hear that the Commission is going to reach out to the most marginalised and vulnerable people who are so important and integral to the rest of the final report. So thank you very much, Nat. So now I'd like to throw to our live stream audience and ask the commissioners some of your burning questions. So let's just see what's come up. The first one here, it seems that the onus is on the federal government. We hear little about the roles and responsibilities of state or local governments. Where should these focus their efforts? So I'll throw that open to the panel.
Look, I'm happy to kick it off. I just emphasise that the agreement is a national agreement, and there are multiple jurisdictions, Commonwealth, states and territories, and also, as Michael mentioned, the president of the Australian Local Government Association is a co-signatory to the agreement. Obviously, local government, 500 plus councils are a little bit, they're differently structured and have different obligations to, say, a jurisdiction, a state or territory government. But it needs to be absolutely clear that every jurisdiction has responsibility, not the Commonwealth solely. And sometimes when we think about what the landscape looks like and people will start to contemplate the national voice to Parliament, we in the report, we make it clear as well that there are any number of processes that are attempting to get to the kind of relationship between government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across various jurisdictions. So treaty processes in Victoria and Queensland, for example, and voice in South Australia, just to name a few. Just to reiterate that point, that every jurisdiction is responsible and are held to account, and each of the partners to the agreement must, as a requirement of the agreement, both develop implementation plans, so how they're going to go about implementing the agreement, and report annually against those plans. That's a fairly routine, run-of-the-mill kind of accountability framework, but each of those jurisdictions, local government, are responsible in that way. Not sure if Michael and Nat might want to add to that.
I might just add before Michael, you may want to jump in here too. Obviously, those now 19 targets under the agreement, many of them, the levers for change are actually held by state and territory governments. When we think about things like over-incarceration of children and young people in youth detention, over-representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. So while there can be national stewardship, there's certainly a lot of comment made within our report about what's going on differently in different jurisdictions. And perhaps a really important aspect to add on to the answer to this question is that the way we're reporting the data at the moment is still very much at the national level. And we are hearing calls from all over the country for some of that data reporting to actually be at the state or even the regional level to give it true meaning. Because one of the challenges about various states and territories all reporting their data and then it being aggregated up, and to use Rom's own words, the tyranny of the aggregate, means that you can't see where there's dire progress in some states and territories and fantastic progress in others.
Great, thank you, Nat. Yeah, the point around data is very, very important. We want to hear from those hidden cohorts, as you mentioned earlier. So there's another question here, and they all seem to be from Anonymous. So what are the most pressing of the targets to be addressed? And again, I'll throw that open to the panel.
Josh, I'll make a start on that. In one sense, obviously, all of these things are given equal weight in the agreement. So it's not as though the agreement expresses priority around some. But I think there are some differences just in how we're tracking at this point. So there are about 4 of the targets where we're broadly tracking on progress, 2 of which are quite important. One is 4-year-olds who are enrolled in an early childhood education and care program in the last year prior to compulsory schooling. That's one where we've achieved pretty good results. Interestingly, youth detention, rates of youth detention are actually down, and that issue seems to be, at least at the moment, on the numbers, not looking so bad. There are a number which are not looking good, and then there are some that are kind of in the middle. I mean, there are some very important indicators in the agreement, most notably life expectancy, right? And if you think about the gap in life expectancy, I'll just talk about males for the moment, because they live shorter and the gap is actually greater between Indigenous and non-Indigenous males. 15 years ago, the life expectancy for an Aboriginal male at birth was 67.5 years. On the most recent data, it's 71.5. So a 4-year improvement in life expectancy, that seems pretty good, right? Like that's a degree of progress. For non-Indigenous, over the same time period, life expectancy has gone from 79 to 80. So life expectancy has improved for Aboriginal males over the period, and the gap has closed a bit, or shrunk a bit, narrowed, but it's not narrowing fast enough to meet the target that is enshrined in the agreement. So the agreement sets perhaps the ambitious target of eliminating that gap altogether by the 2030s. The moment the narrowing of the gap is just too slow for that to be achieved. Then you have other ones, and I guess to Natalie's point earlier, I would contrast it with an indicator like adult incarceration, where it's not that the gap isn't narrowing, it's that the indicator is going the wrong way. It's going up. So the rate of incarceration of Aboriginal people per 100,000 population is going up, not down. Moreover, it was going up and up and up on a trajectory before the agreement was signed as well. So it's as though there's this kind of existing trajectory. An agreement gets signed that says, well, we have ambitions now to bring it down. It's very unclear what it is in the agreement or the actions pursuant to the agreement in the various implementation plans and other things that would give you any confidence that that was going to happen. And I think this goes to a point that Natalie has made about the conduct of governments under the agreement, that sometimes it's about what's in the implementation plans themselves. What is it the government is explicitly signing up to say, I'm doing this in order to close the gap. But there's another dimension, which are all the things that are not in the implementation plans. It's all of the decisions that governments take in their ordinary conduct of government that have implications potentially for one of these indicators. And decisions are made in the context of criminal justice and law enforcement that will have implications. They're not always made explicitly with closing the gap in mind. But I guess the point we're trying to make is this is an agreement that binds government. It has to figure into government decision-making across the length and breadth of government decisions, not just a series of individual things that governments have explicitly identified or defined to be relevant to the closing the gap targets.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so getting traction across the board is so fundamental to success. So any comments from Rom or Nat around that particular question?
I would take us back to what has been the focus of the review, which are those priority reforms. And when we went out, so again, if jump onto our website, our second paper was our review methodology. And we made it explicit that we thought that given the difference between this agreement and the previous one being the priority reforms, that was the most important area to attend to and to focus on. And that's exactly what we've done. So I guess I'm less attracted to thinking there's a hierarchy of targets that need to be met or not, and not that these are mutually exclusive, but to get people focused on the how and how we're tracking against the delivering on the how. The other thing to say about if we're talking about data, talking about measurement, presently the priority reforms do not have any measurement. That the measurement has not been agreed. There are no indicators, and so this again, if you're thinking about structural change, systemic structural reform that will live a life, have to get that kind of sorted within the context of the agreement. How do we measure the priority reforms? What are they going to track like over time? And who, in terms of data design and development, who's making decisions about what it would look like? What are the measurables? Going to that priority reform 3 that I mentioned earlier, how will governments identify and work towards the elimination of racism? That cannot just be an indicator that's plucked out of the air. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have absolutely got to be a part of that design process. So while it's tempting to say these are more important than others in terms of the targets, I just kind of also get people to focus on those priority reforms and what needs to happen in order for us to track those properly over the life of the agreement.
Great. And so, Rom, to your point, the next question we have here is asking us how difficult is it to measure intangible things like ways of working and systemic reform? So perhaps, Nat, we can turn to you to discuss that particular question.
Yeah, well, that's a question that we have grappled with throughout the life of our review. There was originally a commitment to develop up data sets and data items for specifically the priority reforms, which are exactly what you just described there. That's that real systemic change. We noted really early on, and you can find this in our first paper that we put out there about our approach to the engagement, that quantitative data is never going to tell you that full picture around systemic change, and that it is going to be the felt, lived experience on the ground that might be the only way that you can capture that. So we believe there needs to be a healthy dose of both quantitative and that lived experience of change or lack thereof. And so we are still waiting for some of the, at very least, the quantitative as well as the qualitative data measures to be developed up for the priority reforms. We're hoping that progress will begin on those shortly. But the way we've approached this review is really to understand it from the perspective of all of the people we've spoken to on the ground. And yes, it's predominantly been Aboriginal community controlled organisations whom we've spoken to understand not just what it feels like, but what they diagnose as some of the causation of change. We've also spoken to some government agencies, and I must say some have been very full and frank and fearless about what they feel have been the obstacles to real systemic change within their own agencies and across government. The case study approach that I mentioned that we'll be taking in the next report will really be the nub of that for us. So looking at a specific example of a life outcome that governments have all committed to change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and looking at it through the lens of the various priority reforms. For us, that will be a really interesting way to measure whether there has or hasn't been change. But we'll keep trying to refine and improve the data sources, and we're looking to governments to do the same, to really measure whether the systemic change they've committed to has real life breathed into it.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Nat. There's a really interesting question that's just come through Pigeonhole, and an audience member, or a couple actually, are interested to ask. They're asking, did your review find that some jurisdictions were contributing more than others to positive outcomes and active improvement? So now's your time to name and shame, I guess.
I'm going to leave this to the other two to answer, but I think it's fair to say that in different areas, different states had different sorts of stories to tell. And, you know, there were things that were working quite well in certain jurisdictions, but then other jurisdictions kind of doing a bit better in other areas of priority reform. So some that had a very strong partnership arrangement put in place, others less so, but they might be having other positive stories to tell, for example, on priority reform number 2, the empowerment of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and that sort of thing. But what do you think, Natalie and Ron?
Yeah, I think that's right, Michael. I mean, when you think about the magnitude of the agreement, there are, 9 jurisdictions, if we're just talking about the Commonwealth, and states and territories, all of them doing things different. Like, we live in a federation. Mostly we enjoy the federation. Sometimes it's a frustration, but mostly we enjoy it. And there are autonomous governments determining their priorities. So there'll be variance, if I can put it that way. So that's at the kind of jurisdictional level. Then you go down into agencies. If we're looking at transformation of government agencies, huge variability right across the board. And so some of the things that we've had a look at are trying to get a sense of where are those pockets of good practice or development and reform that's taking place. And the report reveals a number of those. So I think that's worth having a look at. We also speak to a number of jurisdictions that have contradicted the agreement, decisions made by governments that are counter to the objectives of the agreement. And we've spoken about new bail laws in various jurisdictions that would preemptively or predictably increase the rates of juvenile or young people incarcerated. So I'm not making a point about whether governments can or can't make those decisions for themselves, but you can see the obvious tension that sits within a national agreement that has specific objectives, yet decisions made by governments are predictably going to move the dial in the opposite direction. But Nat, I'm not sure. Have you got some thoughts?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we definitely have found pockets of good practice, but the key thing here is I don't think we could say there was any government in Australia where we could find the underlying systemic change that the agreement actually calls for to implement those 4 priority reforms. And we found some, I don't want to say areas of contradictory practice within the one government, but you can find a government where, for example, in Queensland government, you would argue that the establishment of the path to treaty legislation, the establishment of a truth and healing inquiry, all of these things go towards that first priority reform. And the movement towards treaty in some of the other jurisdictions would be one method of really encapsulating that first priority reform under the agreement. However, then there are practices, as Rom spoke to, where you've got tougher bail laws that mean there are more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being locked up than ever before. And so there is that differentiation in practice, but then you've also got New South Wales, where you've got some really incredible examples of the way the Aboriginal community controlled sector have been brought into the development of not just data, but the narratives around data, and even the development of the implementation plan itself, which is not something.
What's really interesting and it's coming through quite strong in Pigeonhole is the voice to Parliament. And so there's a question here that's asking us, in what ways would a voice to Parliament support progress on closing the gap targets? So I know that we spoke about that a little while ago, but there's clear interest in how the voice to Parliament can really influence the closing the gap strategy. So open that up.
I think Trish, the way we see it is that, and obviously, you know, we're a Commonwealth agency. We're not taking a position in the referendum, and nor is that sought in the context of this review, right? It's very much about the closing the gap agreement. I think Natalie put it well earlier, which is not to say that we need a particular outcome in that referendum is required in order to deliver on the closing the gap, the promise of the closing the gap agreement. But I guess we are thinking about the fact that we're bringing out a draft report now in July of 2023, a final report in December of 2023, and we have an expectation that there'll be a referendum sometime in the middle of that period, precisely at the time when we are out in the field getting feedback about the draft report. And so we want to be giving a bit of thought, irrespective of the outcome, as to, you know, whatever the outcome in the referendum, how might that outcome kind of fit within the closing the gap architecture. So the way Natalie put it, I think, is absolutely right. If we end up with a constitutionally enshrined voice, then, you know, perhaps there's a role for it in playing doing some of the work in terms of the accountability gap that currently exists in the agreement. If not, then we would look to other mechanisms potentially. So I think it's really about us remaining nimble, noting that the importance of this agreement is sustained irrespective, and whatever the outcome, we have to make sure that we've got the right sort of architecture to achieve the promise that is kind of at the heart of the 2020 agreement.
Thank you, Michael. Nat or Rom, would you like to feed into that particular answer?
No, nothing really more to add than what Michael's put forward, but do take a read of our report, because, you know, as Michael said, this work is clearly situated within an ecosystem and a debate, and, you know, the yarns, the big yarns that the country needs to have right now. So that hasn't been invisible to us. So when, as I made the point earlier, there are multiple jurisdictions making multiple legislative and structural reforms, and how they turn out is unknown at this point. But we do make the point that wherever things may land, there's may well be a complementarity there, and that's important to recognise that the national agreement on closing the gap doesn't become redundant, and in fact, if anything, there'd be a concern that governments step away from the agreement that they've very much committed to. These are their commitments. Those actions are government actions over the life of the agreement, however long that is. Most will kind of contemplate a 10-year time frame. But the agreement lasts as long as the agreement is in play and replaced by another agreement. So these are firm commitments by every government in this country.
Great, thank you, Ron. We've got enough time for just one more question from the audience. And here's an interesting one. So does the PC believe the legislative body with watchdog-like powers, as described in its review, should be established regardless of whether the voice referendum succeeds?
I'm happy to take that one on, if you like.
Yeah, you go. Nat.
It's been really interesting following the media on our report, because it certainly talks about us recommending a watchdog-like body to be established. I think it's really important to clarify here that the agreement itself, governments actually committed back in 2020 to establishing what was called an independent mechanism under that third priority reform. So when Michael was talking earlier about the third priority reform being that commitment to transforming government agencies, within that commitment, if you read the agreement, there is actually a commitment to establishing an independent mechanism to hold governments accountable to that particular priority reform. What we've recommended in our review is, well, first of all, we note the fact that that body hasn't been established yet, despite the commitment to setting it up. But we say, thinking about the lack of accountability mechanisms within the agreement itself, the fact that there's nothing to hold governments accountable to failure in real time, the fact that there's actually nothing really independent about anything in the accountability mechanisms that exist. For example, an annual report is really just an exercise in self-assessment. We're proposing that that particular independent mechanism, when it is set up, is not just for that third priority reform, but rather to hold the agreement in its entirety, to hold governments accountable to the agreement in its entirety. Rom and Michael, you might want to add to that too.
Oh, just to say that it's not a new idea. We're just saying that it needs to have more teeth than it currently looks like in conception within the agreement. Needs to be something that covers the whole of the agreement, not just one priority reform.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Nat and Rom have said. And I guess just noting the spirit in which this draft recommendation is offered. I mean, our draft report is that it incorporates a number of findings on which we hope to get a bit of reaction and a bit of evidence one way or the other. It has a number of information requests where we explicitly ask to learn more on particular topics. And yes, it does in a handful of areas throw out a few ideas about, and this is a good example, we think that there's a need for the independent mechanism. We know there's a need for the independent mechanism under Priority Reform 3. An open question as to whether it should have a broader remit to cover the entirety of the agreement. And we throw that open to people to kind of mull over and give us some views on. So that's really what we're hoping to get between now and December via submissions, via our engagement, and other consultations.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, panel. So that's all we have time for today. Sincere thank you to our speakers for their time and participation. Productivity Commissioner Chair Michael Brennan and Commissioners Natalie Siegel-Brown and Romlie Mokak. The work of the Productivity Commission is crucial to closing the gap and for better life outcomes for our mob. Congratulations on this landmark interim report, and we look forward to seeing the Commission's final report and findings. And thank you all for your robust and very insightful questions this afternoon. Everyone on this live stream today will receive a post-event email with a link to the recording of today's discussion, which will also be available on CEDA's website in about a week's time. Thanks everyone again, and please stay in touch with upcoming discussions via ceda.com.au, where you can also register for CEDA's upcoming events.